talking about people coming and making presentations to you, and maybe they're the right person, man or woman, to run this business or take it to that next level or not. What would you look for? I mean, first impression sort of thing you have half an hour to decide this person is going to run this business or not. What are the things that you'd examine?
So what I like to hear is, somebody presenting, and I can think of one recently that was very, very good that I did invest in. It was called Dig It Gloves. It was gloves that protect women's nails, because who knew that women spend $1.8 billion on their nails in North America a year? I didn't. And any chance
without my wife, that drops to $112,000.
What I've learned is if you can invest in the vanity of women, that's a great investment. So a glove like that is protecting a woman's nail, and the two entrepreneurs didn't say to me, look, I'm very passionate about my business. Everybody's passionate about their business. What they were able to say is, look, here's the competition. Here's the margin. Here are the retail margins. Here's the cost of inventory. And as the more I pushed and pushed and pushed, trying to find a flaw in their story, I couldn't find one. And I went, wow, these two women really know what they're doing, and I got to invest.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I'm hearing there is a lot of people come and they know their idea, whether they can express it, as you alluded to earlier, 90 seconds, but they do know their idea, but they don't know their business.
Yeah.
You just described it as somebody who knew their business.
I've found now, and I've done a lot of deals, that very often women are better in startups than men. They're more objective. They're not as emotional, believe it or not. They understand the goal. They work better together, and they're able to, in many, many cases, articulate better than their compatriots that are men. I'm just about making money. I don't care if it's a goat, a dog, a woman, or a man. Who do I invest in to make money? And more, I'm putting money into entrepreneurial deals brought forward by women. They're just better.
Let me talk about just changes in business. Me too. I want to talk about changes in business. What are the biggest, the kind of things when I say biggest change that you see in how we're going to do business in the next decade? Like if we'd met 10 years ago, we would have been talking about, or 15, internet stuff and, how we're going to communicate, even how we're going to solicit clients. You see those ongoing changes there.
Yeah, I do actually. I think what I'm beginning to realize, and let's just focus on Canadian businesses, because so many businesses that what we do are supporting resource-based economies or resource services, we're going to have to figure out in the next decade how to attach ourselves beyond the United States, because they're going to be suffering for a long time with very low GDP growth. They have lots of competition in their own jurisdiction on it as it stands, and they're 3 to 4% GDP growth. All of these other countries, we used to call Brazil an emerging market. It's not emerging, it's emerged. Yeah. It's got 34 million people in the middle class that want stuff. And I encourage any Canadian, and I try and find deals like this, that are saying, you know what, I'm not stopping in Chicago. I'm going right to Brazil to sell these guys something. Because they have more money, they have less debt, they're growing faster, and they've got a massive consumer market. So I'm saying that Canadians should actually start to say, instead of having 80% of our goods and services going to the United States, our objective should be in the next decade to reduce that to 60%. And then service everybody else. We'll make a lot more money, a lot more diversification, and we as an economy and a people will be much richer. And that's all I care about.
Communication technology is also a challenge right now, not a huge opportunity, of course, but I'm not sure how many people in our audience today are integrating Twitter, for example, in their marketing plans. Are they integrating Facebook in their marketing plans? And if so, are they doing it effectively? And those type of communication opportunities brought by technology.
Yeah, Michael, that's a fantastic question. I'll tell you something. I've learned that the Facebook and the Twittering and all that stuff is paramount to be understood by every business. I got involved with Twittering with Arlene Dickinson in probably season 3 or something. She took me out one day for lunch. We were shooting Dragons and said, have you seen this thing? And I said, no, I'm not going to waste my time messing around with these teenage deals. And she said, no, this is brand building for your O'Leary Funds business. I've got thousands of followers now, and I do it every day, and I've got a team of people that make sure that these things get out, and they communicate what I'm seeing in the market as an investor in my own funds, and it's very important that this is that message stays consistent. It's brand building. Mm-hmm. Same with Facebook. And I've found other CEOs and other companies doing exactly the same thing. So this social media is part of extending your brand and communicating with your constituency in a direct fashion Thousands of people know that I'm here right now because I tweeted this before I got here. They know what I'm talking about. I'm going to report it later as I go back online. I'm enjoying the experience. I want to tell them about it. It's part of what I'm made of, and I think it's very important for CEOs to understand it, and certainly an issue for HR, because this is how you attract more people into your business. That's what matters.
What about e-commerce itself, selling online? There's always issues about security issues and things of that sort. Have they been resolved, or how would you, if you thought your potential customers were worried about that aspect, how would you reassure them?
Well, what I've learned about e-commerce, and people really didn't understand this till almost just recently, the cost of customer acquisition is so high that often for years as you're trying to build that platform, you're losing money. And because it's so difficult to attract traffic to a website, maintain it, service it, that often it's better not to go there till you've built a business through retail perhaps, or through direct mail even, before you try and spend the thousands of dollars it takes to acquire customers online. I want to see evidence that an entrepreneur, understands their cost of customer acquisition and maintenance before I'll invest in an online commerce strategy at all.
One of the aspects I used to think, a way of putting it, who would benefit from my own business success more than I would? And it was when we were building a manufacturing plant myself, and it was all self-financed. And I got somebody who was, we needed a big flour dispenser, so I went to Rogers Flour and I got them to actually pay for it. It was $4 million, which was a lot of money to us at that time. And then we signed a 10-year contract and we paid 1 penny more, over time. So they financed it basically for free for us. My question was always, who can I partner with here? And marketing, whether it's a marketing strategy, we see this in simple things like I bring out the latest Star Wars movie, so I'm going to do it with Burger King and I'm going to do it with this. What about that aspect going forward?
It's a very good strategy, Michael, and I think partnering with strength always works, but I've even taken it further than that, particularly in strategies that involve startups. If you have a great idea and it's patented, why do you involve yourself in manufacturing or distribution at all? Why wouldn't you go to a strategic and license it to them? And very often when I see entrepreneurs that are looking for $500,000 on Dragon's Den for a great idea, I say to them, you know what, I'll give you that, but I'm going to fire you. I want 100% of the business. I'll give you 10% of whatever I make as a licensor of this technology, and I'm going to go to a Procter & Gamble if it's a food product, or I'm going to go to a 3M if it's a technology, and I'm going to license it to them, because I know how to do that. That's how I built the learning company, all licenses. Licenses are better in many, many, many ways for many people. The whole idea of being an entrepreneur is there's only one goal. Get rich.
Let me guess. Yeah.
It's the whole idea is to get rich, so you're free. You don't care how you get there, as long as you don't go to jail doing it.
Well, you don't in Canada go to jail for virtually anything in business. In the States, it's more dangerous. Boy, anything goes. I want to talk a little bit about another side of what you do, and that's, as you were saying, that you look throughout the world, you manage huge amounts of money, coming toward $2 billion now with the O'Leary group of funds. Again, and please correct me, but it seems to me what your approach there is to look for quality companies that pay a dividend, pay a yield, I should say, so you're making money with that side of the investment at the same time. But there's lots around that, and I'm just wondering about selection of those kind of companies. Does it differ than somebody at Dragon's Den? Are the same kind of rules when you mentioned a moment ago that the one thing is if you're turning down this deal, there's 50 more, lining up at the door. Well, even maybe more so when you're talking about publicly traded companies. You don't have to fall in love with anything because there's another opportunity.
Sure there is. I'll tell you a very simple story, and I didn't, of course, know when I was learning this. I was so young, but my mother used to be a seamstress on a clothing line in Montreal, Canada called Kitty's Talk. She would make winter clothing for children. But 20 girls would be sewing these things up, and they made high-end clothing. There was a time when you could actually manufacture clothing in Canada. You can't do that now. It's very hard because of the cost of doing it. But she used to come home. They used to pay them on Thursdays. And back in those days, we're talking the early 50s and the late 40s, she would take a third of her paycheck every week on Thursday morning and buy Bell bonds, because back in those days, Bell bonds were like government bonds, and they had these little coupons you'd clip, and she would come home and tell my brother and I didn't know what she was talking about. She'd always say, never spend the principal, just the interest. And every week she'd pound that into my head. Of course, I had no idea what it meant. She died a couple of years ago, and I was the executor of her estate, and I realized when I was pouring over her assets, she had every single dollar she'd ever made. She went through 2 marriages. She never merged her own capital with her husband's. She raised her family. She had every single cent she'd ever made, and she lived off the interest. I have that disease now, and my attitude is...
it's genetic.
It's genetic. And she was... The whole fundamentals of O'Leary funds, it's the only... I remember when I went on the road, it was because I founded the company to invest my own money in. I tell every manager I hire, I don't pick the stocks. I'm not interested in doing that. I set the mandates. I say to them, I never want to own a stock, ever, that doesn't pay a dividend. Ever. And if you do buy one that doesn't, I'm going to fire you. Every single security I own drips cash like a chicken on a spit. I get cash. Because to me... buying a stock that doesn't pay a dividend is simply a speculation, and here's why. In the last decade, and this is a stat that people forget, in the last 40 years, forget a decade, 73% of returns came from dividends, not capital appreciation. And of course that makes sense. The S&P has done nothing for 10 years. So you take a company like Bombardier, that wonderful bastion of government subsidy, and you buy that stock from them a decade ago. You're basically saying to the board of directors, and I'm sure these are wonderful people, don't send me my portion of the profits every quarter. You're smarter than I am. You keep it because you don't pay a dividend. You keep my money, and you do whatever you want with it because you're smarter than I am. How have you done the last decade? You've made nothing. Nothing. So I believe the philosophy, another one would be Magna, till they got rid of that guy that was buying racehorses and everything else. At the end of the day, I believe there's a different culture in a company where the CEO gets up and says, Kevin O'Leary's a shareholder, and I have to send him a check every quarter. I got to make sure I have enough cash. Versus a company that says, I keep all their money, what the hell with them? Who cares? If they don't want a dividend, I will never, ever, ever, ever own a stock that doesn't pay a dividend.
So you're looking at, obviously, paying the dividend, but the dividend record, then the reliability of that dividend over the last, pick a period of time.
Oh, no, it's worse than that. They got to be growing free cash flow. I don't look at earnings. I don't buy any companies that aren't growing cash flow because I want more dividends. I want more payments. I want more security on my bonds. And more these days, Michael, I'm finding those companies, you got to think about GDP growth as the rising tide. If you go and buy a railroad in a country like the United States, you're not going to get earnings growth more than 3 or 4% because the whole economy is only growing 3 or 4%. Take, for example, telcos. I love telcos because they have lots of cash flow, wireless services. Would you rather own, I have nothing against Rogers, great company, I'll never own it. It's the most expensive telco in the world. I can buy a Brazilian telco that has 30 million subscribers, pays a 7% dividend, that's growing twice as fast, that has half as much debt, and has no competition. That's an investment. So I'm agnostic. I don't care if it's in Cambodia or Brazil or India or China or Canada. I want the best company in that sector that pays me the most cash, period.
Let me ask about currency risk because, currencies play a huge example. A huge proportion of what the currency was is going to figure into, did you make any money? For example, for Canadians who've been investing in, let's say they even got a 10% bond in the last year or since March of 2009, well, they're going to be down because the currency's risen faster than any return they would have gotten.
Yeah, you know what you're talking about on that. There's no question because we watched our Canadian dollar go from the 2066 cents to way above parity now. So here's my attitude about that. I take no currency risk. I completely hedge it out. In other words, I can buy currency forwards, and I do, so I have no currency risk because I have no idea what currencies are going to do. But I will say this. In the last year, and this is the first time this has ever occurred, there are more billion-dollar market cap companies outside of North America than in it. Never been that way before. Because they're so large and they're growing so fast, they're issuing their securities in US dollars and euros. So I don't have to buy a Brazilian or an Indian company in local currency. I can buy their convertible debenture in US dollars, and that costs me about 5 basis points or nothing to hedge out the currency risk, which is what I do. So I'm a Canadian in Canadian dollars owning zero currency risk of a Brazilian or Indian company.
Let me just come back to the overview here, and one of the things that you've just shared with us is how you are looking internationally and the opportunities in countries like Brazil and India's provided opportunities, and many others, as you've alluded to. What about the big dark cloud? And the big dark cloud to me is a sovereign debt crisis going on in Europe. Portugal is the latest to seek bailout there, but Italy is just fighting with Belgium to see who's next after them. We've got Bill Gross, who is the manager of the largest bond fund in the world, and he says, I'm not going to own any of the U.S. Treasuries because I think the U.S. situation is so negative. I'm just wondering about that and your perspective on that.
You think about the United States and think about the pressures they've got. Gross is making a very good point, but what he's really worried about is the devaluation of the dollar. Now, as you as an investor, let's just take a company like P&G, which has done a lot of pushing into India. The less valuable the U.S. dollar gets, the more their earnings go up. That's the perverse relationship of that. So that's why the stock market has been doing so well with all the concerns about debt and currency and everything else. The truth is the earnings are spectacular. So from an individual investor's point of view, I don't invest in governments. I don't invest in partnerships with governments. I don't buy government debt. I invest in companies run by men and women who are capitalists who want to make money. Anything the government touches, as far as I'm concerned, is bad. It's that simple.
Yeah. Just to come off of, there's so many things we could say about that. Just to come off of, looking internationally, what about Canada itself? Canada's really high on the list of many analysts throughout the world. They like our banking system. They love our natural resources. Obviously, the Canadian dollar's made them a ton of money, depending on which country they're coming from. Where do you put Canada in your sort of list of places to invest?
Right now, the Canadian market, the stock market, is trading at a 21 multiple, the most expensive on Earth. So if you were a Martian that was coming down to invest in the world and you were given $1 million Martian dollars or any dollar, you would probably go to places where they're growing faster and they're trading at a lower PE. I'm not saying you shouldn't invest in Canada. It's just that right now it's not the best value anymore because of gold, oil, natural gas, and resources. They're very, very expensive, and they've made our market very... You're paying 21 years' worth of earnings when you buy the TSX index. That's a lot. Versus 13 for the S&P, 14 for the Hong Kong index. I'm just saying a little diversification for me. Of course, I'm a big investor in Canada. I own everything here, but I've certainly diversified my risk to other economies. And I'll tell you something, we are the luckiest people on earth in this country. We should be so happy with where we're at right now. And, you only have to go abroad to realize this is really good here, really good.